You know, what if I told you that the single biggest threat to America's future isn't some foreign adversary, but a number? A number that's ticking up every single second of every single day. Well, today, we are going to unpack that number, a massive IOU that has just blown past a line many thought we'd never cross. Let's get into it.
And there it is, $38 trillion. That is the gross national debt of the United States. For an entire generation, this was just an abstract warning, right? It was a problem for some distant future. Well, that future isn't so distant anymore. It's here.
It's so easy to get lost in all those zeros, it almost becomes meaningless. So in this explainer, we're going to break down what this absolutely mind-boggling number really means for the economy, for America's place in the world, and, most importantly, for you and your wallet.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with just how fast we hit this milestone. Then, we'll peek at how the government's credit card actually works. We'll explore the dangerous feedback loop the debt is now stuck in, see how it's hitting your personal finances, and then zoom out to the global consequences. And finally, we'll tackle the impossible political choice that's stopping anyone from fixing it.
Okay, so first up, this milestone itself. Look, hitting $38 trillion is a huge deal, but the really scary part of this story isn't just the grand total, it's the incredible speed at which it's growing.
Just think about that for a second. $1 trillion tacked on in just 82 days. To put that into perspective, that's more than the entire national debt the country built up in its first 200 years of existence. This is not a slow leak anymore, folks. This is a full-on financial hemorrhage.
And to make this a little less abstract, let's make it personal. If you were to divide that $38 trillion among every single man, woman, and child in the U.S., it comes out to about $111,000 apiece. That's your share. It's like a hidden mortgage held against the future of every single citizen.
And look, don't just take my word for it. This quote is from the Congressional Budget Office, the government's own official scorekeeper. And their projections, they don't show things leveling off. They show a relentless climb for decades to come. So the key takeaway here is that this isn't some temporary spike. It is a deep, structural problem.
So how in the world did we even get here? To get that, we need to look at the basic mechanics of how the government handles its money. Honestly, the easiest way to think about it is like a household that has spent way more than it earns, year after year, for decades. The national debt? That's just the total outstanding balance on the national credit card.
And the engine that keeps pushing that credit card balance higher and higher is the annual deficit. That's the shortfall in just a single year. And here's a wild fact for you. The last time the U.S. government actually ran a surplus, a year where it took in more than it spent, was 2001. That's right, for over 2 decades, it's been nothing but deficits.
Let's look at fiscal year 2025 as a perfect example. Projections show the government will bring in about $5.23 trillion in revenue. The problem? It's set to spend $7.01 trillion. The math here is simple and pretty brutal. That leaves an annual deficit of almost $1.8 trillion, and all of that gets added right on top of the national debt pile.
So where does that revenue actually come from? Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because so much of it comes directly from you and me. Over half of it comes from individual income taxes. Another third comes from payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare. Put those together, and that's the vast majority of the pie. Corporate taxes, a much, much smaller slice.
Now let's talk about the spending side. And this visualizes the new, frankly, terrifying reality we're in. For the first time, the fastest growing major expense in the federal budget is the interest on the debt itself. At $970 billion, the U.S. is now spending more money just paying interest on old debt than it does on the entire national defense budget. That money buys 0 tanks, pays 0 soldiers, and funds 0 research. It's just gone.
And that staggering interest payment, it leads us directly to our next section. This dangerous feedback loop that's making the whole crisis worse. See, the debt has now reached a point where it's actually feeding on itself, creating a vicious cycle that's getting harder and harder to break out of.
So here it is, the debt spiral, step by step. It all kicked off when the Federal Reserve started jacking up interest rates to fight inflation. But for a country that's $38 trillion in the hole, that had a catastrophic side effect. As all that old, cheap debt matures, it has to be refinanced with new, expensive debt at these new high rates. That makes the interest payments explode, which makes the deficit bigger, which forces the government to borrow even more money at those same high rates. It is a classic sovereign debt trap.
So who exactly are we paying all this interest to? Who holds all this debt? You know, there's a common myth that it's mostly owed to rivals like China. But the reality? It's completely different. Only about a quarter of U.S. debt is held by foreign countries. The really uncomfortable truth is that America's biggest creditor is America itself.
Yeah, that 75% held right here at home is split into two big buckets. First, you have intergovernmental holdings. This is basically money the government owes itself. The Social Security Trust Fund is the biggest single creditor. Then you have public holdings. This is that held by the Federal Reserve, by U.S. banks, by the pension funds managing your retirement, and even by individual investors. The crucial point here is that the stability of the entire American financial system is now completely tied to this debt.
Which brings us to the most important question of all. How does all this Washington and Wall Street maneuvering actually hit you? Because this isn't just their problem anymore. The consequences are seeping directly into the daily lives of everyday people.
And this is how. When the U.S. government has to pay over 5% to borrow money, that basically sets the interest rate floor for everybody else. It translates directly into those soaring mortgage rates that make buying a house impossible. It means more expensive car loans. It's why credit card APRs are so crippling. It also chokes off business investment, which means fewer new jobs and wages that just don't keep up. And all along, there's the long-term risk of inflation, that hidden tax that just eats away at every dollar you've managed to save.
The pain from this doesn't just stop at our borders. The national debt is no longer just a domestic economic problem. It's a direct and growing threat to America's standing in the world and to the dominance of the U.S. dollar.
You see, for decades, the U.S. has enjoyed what's called the exorbitant privilege. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, everyone needs it. That created a constant global demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. Essentially, it allowed America to finance its massive spending habits by borrowing cheaply in a currency that the rest of the world had no choice but to buy. It's been a financial superpower.
But that privilege, that superpower, is now under serious strain. Years of massive deficits and political gridlock have made both allies and rivals question just how stable America's finances really are. And that has fueled de-dollarization movements as countries like China, Russia, and the BRICS nations actively look for ways to trade without using the dollar. The threat here isn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding erosion of that privilege.
Okay, so if the problem is this obvious and the consequences are this severe, it leads to the question everybody asks: why doesn't the government just fix it? And the answer to that lies in a political trap where every single solution is seen as way more painful than the problem itself.
At the end of the day, there are only two ways to fix a deficit. You either cut spending or you raise revenue through taxes. The problem is, politically, both of these are radioactive. The biggest parts of the budget, Social Security and Medicare, are the untouchable third rail of American politics. And raising taxes? That's just as unpopular with voters. So faced with these two terrible options, both parties have consistently picked a third. Just keep borrowing and kick the can down the road.
Now, this political paralysis has led some people to wonder if there's a kind of cheat code. A theoretical way out is to just inflate the debt away. The idea is simple. You borrow trillions of today's valuable dollars, then you let high inflation run wild for decades, devaluing the currency, and then you pay back that debt with future dollars that are worth way, way less.
But here is the ultimate catch-22. We just lived through the painful cost of that solution. The high inflation we saw recently was so damaging that the Federal Reserve had to step in and crush it by raising interest rates. And as we've already seen, those high interest rates are the exact thing that kicked off and is now accelerating the debt spiral. The cheat code has been disabled.
So this is where we're left. That $38 trillion number isn't the actual disease. It's just the fever. The disease is a structural deficit born from decades of political leaders being unwilling to make spending and revenue match up. The path forward is going to require a level of political courage that, frankly, leaders for a generation have found it much easier to avoid. The problem is crystal clear. The solutions are agonizing, which leaves just one final question. What choice will be made?